Hello, everyone. So my name is Liz Jackson. I'm a philosophy professor at St. Louis University, and I have been talking about this big question, does God exist, with some of my students this week. And I just thought it would be a good time to kind of make a video, give some of my thoughts about this matter. This is going to be a pretty introductory video to just kind of how to think about the question whether God exists, especially from a philosophical perspective, so kind of an introduction to how philosophers often think about the question. But at the end, I'll give a little bit of my own thoughts to this question based on some thinking and researching I've been doing. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is just kind of talk about God's existence in terms of sort of the arguments, so some of the pros and some of the cons, the arguments for and the arguments against. So this is going to be a very basic overview. There's going to be a lot of simplifying going on here, but I do think it's helpful to kind of just have a short video that sort of goes over the main pros and cons. So some of the arguments for God's existence, one of the ones philosophers will often talk about is called the ontological argument. This argument was originally given by Anselm, or at least Anselm was one of the first ones to give it. And Anselm's version is roughly something like this. God is a perfect being. It's more perfect to exist than not to exist. And so God exists. And people have sort of refined Anselm's argument, given contemporary versions of it. And Plantinga, among others, give a kind of contemporary take on a similar argument that's basically appeals to this idea that if God possibly exists, then God necessarily exists. It gets complicated than that, appeals to some stuff in modal logic, but that's the gist of kind of the more modern ontological argument. Okay, next is the cosmological argument. So again, a family of arguments, not just a single argument, but what cosmological arguments basically are is arguments that appeal to origins or the beginning of things, right? So Aquinas' five ways, if you've read or looked at those, are often, I think a lot of those are cosmological arguments. So kind of arguing that things are caused, but there can't be an infinite chain of causes. So God is kind of the uncaused first cause, or God is the unmoved mover. There's also a version of this argument that says that contingent things need some kind of necessary explanation. So there's a necessary being. That kind of finds its roots in Aquinas to a degree as well. And then related to this as well is this idea that God explains why there's something rather than nothing. So that's kind of another family of arguments for God's existence. The next kind of family of arguments is what's known as design arguments. There's different versions of design arguments as well, but here the basic idea is that the world seems designed. I have a nice, beautiful picture of mountains, and I don't know if it's a sunset or sunrise, but the world, when you look out at things, seems to be designed, and one maybe decent explanation of why the world seems designed is that God designed it, that there's a designer, right? Here, you want to be careful, right? You want to first be careful you're not making some kind of God of the gaps argument where you say science can't explain this phenomena, therefore God did it, because of course science could progress to the point where it could explain the phenomena. So I'm not saying all design arguments do this, but I do worry sometimes about some of them, especially what's known as like intelligent design style arguments. Sometimes this is a worry for them. And I mean, the other thing is that I think some people think evolution can explain why the world seems designed. I'm not taking a stand on that here, but that is kind of a common response to the design argument, is that evolution is actually the thing that can explain apparent design rather than God. Okay. The final argument for God's existence is what I would say is decently popular among philosophers. Of course, there's debate about it. There's debate about everything, but this is what's known as the fine-tuning argument. This argument says that there are very specific physical laws, such as the gravitational constant, or basically the force that gravity pulls things together. And if these physical laws were very slightly different, life wouldn't exist. We wouldn't live in a universe that permits life. So if gravity were either slightly stronger or slightly weaker, life wouldn't be possible. And it's not just gravity, there's like a number of different physical laws that people making this argument appeal to. That's just one example. And so the thought is because any slight change in these laws wouldn't allow our universe to permit life, the best explanation of this is that God finely tuned these physical laws to, so our universe could be life permitting. So it's kind of an intentional thing. And of course, there are responses to this as well and different versions of it. Okay. So those are kind of some of the main arguments for God's existence. Of course, not an exhaustive list, but it kind of gives you a flavor of some of the main strategies that people use. Um, and here's some of the main strategies that people use to argue that God does not exist. So the first, the most common, widely known argument is argument from evil or the argument from suffering. This argument basically says that there's unnecessary suffering. Some people call this gratuitous evil, basically means pointless evil. But if God existed, especially if God's all powerful and all good, God would be able to prevent evil and God would want to prevent evil. And so if God existed, there wouldn't be unnecessary suffering. And so God does not exist. Um, really big one. I think most theists think at very least this is to some degree evidence against God. They might disagree on how good of evidence and disagree on what kind of responses are best or how many of the responses work. But a common thing that theists will say in response to this is they'll appeal to a theodicy. So a theodicy is an explanation for why God might allow suffering or evil. One way to see what a theodicy is doing is to say the suffering or evil might have seemed unnecessary, but it's actually not unnecessary. And there's also debates about that. Some people worry about the idea of theodicy itself, both whether it's successful, also whether it takes into account the actual experience of sufferers sufficiently, so it might be even somewhat like offensive. So there's lots of debates about theodicy, but it's a general strategy that theists often use against the problem of evil, or the argument from evil. The second big argument God doesn't exist is known as the argument from divine hiddenness. The idea here is that if a loving God existed, God would be evident to all people, or at least to all people that want a relationship with God, to all people who are seeking God and don't have a relationship with God through no fault of their own. So sometimes people here talk about non-resistant non-believers. So this is a little bit simplified, but the idea is that God is hidden from many people, including people that don't have a relationship with God through no fault of their own. And because of that, the best explanation of why God seems hidden, especially to people who are non-resistant, is that God doesn't exist. So a lot of people think this is an interesting and potentially really powerful argument too. So you might say, oh, well, the other list had 5 and this list only has 2. I don't think that's exactly the way that I would look at it. Perhaps, yeah, this list is shorter, but I think many take these 2 arguments to be especially powerful. And I think it's not just about the number of arguments, but about the effectiveness. Are these arguments sound, right? Is like the big question. Or what kind of probabilistic impact do these have on the question of whether it exists, you know? And so even if there's less arguments here, if they have a bigger probabilistic impact or these arguments are especially good or powerful, I don't think the number of arguments is going to be really that important. I think you have to kind of look at things more holistically. Plus, like I said, this is not an exhaustive list, either pro or con. It's just to kind of give you a flavor of some of the big players here. Okay. So this brings us to kind of how people respond. So how do people respond to the evidence? What are sort of the main views on whether God exists? And really there's 3 views that I think are important here. The first, theists. Theists believe that God exists. Agnostics withhold belief on whether God exists. So in other words, they're undecided on whether God exists and they haven't taken a stance either way. And then atheists believe that God does not exist. This might sound really straightforward, really obvious even, but this is actually quite controversial. Some people don't like this way of carving things up, but I think this is actually a really important and helpful way of carving up ways to respond to God's existence or the different views people might have on God's existence. So why this taxonomy? Well, first, it's simple, but I think it has really good explanatory power. It's simple because people fall into 3 categories. They believe it, they believe that it's false, or they withhold belief. They're not decided either way. So at the same time, it has explanatory power because it actually can fit not just God's existence, but it fits any proposition you might consider, right? So think about the statement, it will rain tomorrow, right? I could believe that. Maybe there's like a 90% chance of rain. I could withhold belief on it. I could say, I haven't checked the forecast, and or the forecast predicts a 50% chance of rain, right? I'm undecided. Or I could disbelieve it. Maybe the forecast predicts sun tomorrow, right? So then I would disbelieve that it's going to rain tomorrow or believe that it's not going to rain tomorrow, right? So this taxonomy where there's these three attitudes you can take towards God's existence, it fits any statement or proposition you might consider. I think sometimes when you look up views on God's existence, they'll have these taxonomies that try to bring in Gnosticism, where they say, like, if you take yourself to know, I just don't think that's helpful. I think it overcomplicates things. Yeah, there are interesting questions about belief and knowledge and whether we could ever know that God exists, but I just don't think that's really particularly helpful here, especially taking yourself to know. That's like a very specific attitude, and I don't know why that would be so important and relevant here. So I say if someone starts talking about Gnosticism, no, just do not worry about that. The other thing is, like, one reason people don't like this taxonomy is because they'll say, well, they lack belief that God exists. I'm an atheist because I lack belief. But really lacking belief that God exists, it's not really clear what they're talking about here, because you could lack belief by being agnostic and not having a stance, but you could also lack belief that God exists because you believe that God doesn't exist. And so the problem with this kind of lack theist view is it doesn't really distinguish between agnosticism and atheism, but I think that's actually a really important distinction. In the same way that it's important, I could say I lack belief it's going to rain tomorrow. Well, is it because you haven't taken a stance either way, or because you believe it's not going to rain tomorrow, you know? So I think there's a really important difference between withholding belief and disbelief, but lack theism doesn't give space for that difference. And that's one of many, many problems for lack theism. I just think it's just not a helpful way to think about things. It's much better to be upfront if you're an atheist or an agnostic, and then if you're an atheist, just say you're an atheist because of the problem of evil. I think that's a much more honest position to take, and I don't think that's an irrational, crazy position. And sometimes it almost seems like lack theists think there's not good arguments for atheism, and so they're trying to do this. I'm with, I just lack a belief kind of move. It's just so weird to me. And finally, this taxonomy is widely, if not universally, pretty much universally accepted by philosophers. So you might say, oh, that's an appeal to authority, it doesn't matter. But I actually think it does matter. Philosophers have thought about this a lot. They've really specialized in conceptual analysis and kind of making categories that are joint carving and useful, and there's helpful ways to think about these big questions. And so I think the fact that pretty much any philosopher and pretty much all philosophers of religion accept this way of looking at the problem, and accept these are kind of the three main ways people respond to God's existence, should actually carry some weight. So anyway, I think this is the most helpful taxonomy. Of course, you can add to this. You can talk about levels of confidence that you have in the question of whether God exists. You can talk about different conceptions of God. So I'm not saying this is the end of the story, but I think this is a really helpful sort of starting point for thinking about responses to God's existence. Okay, this final slide, I just want to address the question. You might wonder, well, we've kind of said, look, here's some arguments God exists. Here's some arguments God doesn't exist. Should these just balance out so agnosticism is kind of the default response, or is agnosticism just how we should all respond to the evidence? Is that kind of the rational thing given sort of the state of the arguments? And I want to suggest maybe not. This is, of course, an open question, something I'm interested in exploring. And if you have thoughts on this, let me know in the comments, right? But here's something I've been playing with recently, kind of as a broader thing, not just a thing about God's existence, but I want to kind of give you a little taste of it here. Okay, so here's a distinction between two ways the evidence might go. Sometimes the evidence for P, which is like some proposition or statement, and the evidence for not P, so that proposition or statement is false, sometimes it's exactly tied, right? If I flip a coin and then I hide it from you, your evidence that the coin landed heads and the evidence that the coin didn't land heads or landed tails, it's exactly tied. Like, it's exactly 50-50, assuming it's a fair coin, of course. And so, yeah, like in those kinds of cases, you should withhold belief. Your evidence that I have an even number of hairs on my head, it's exactly tied, right? You should withhold belief, okay? But there's like another possibility, and that's that, yes, the evidence is complicated and there's evidence for P and evidence for not P, but it's not an exact tie. It's what you might call on a par or evidential parity. So when two things are on a par, they're imprecisely equal. And to give a non-evidential example, like a lot of people think, well, choosing between two careers, being a philosopher or being a lawyer, those are imprecisely equal. They both have good and bad things about them. And if you add $1,000 to the philosopher's salary per year, if it were an exact tie, then it would be like, okay, you should be a philosopher, right? But that's not how it works. They're still imprecisely equal. So they're stable. The parities are stable, whereas like a coin flip case, if you tell me it's a coin biased in favor of heads, even if it's just a little bit, then I'm going to be a little bit more confident that it's heads or tails. You're going to lose the tie, but you're not going to lose the parity. And so I think sometimes our evidence is like this, like a complicated murder trial where there's complicated evidence, different kinds of evidence, some statistical, some testimonial, some based on a study, some based on hard evidence and fingerprints, blood, whatever. Like that evidence might not be exactly equal, but it might not clearly support P or not P either. It might be on a par. And I also think controversial issues in philosophy and in ethics are often like this too, where there's just really complicated evidence for and against. People have been debating about it for a really long time, and there's different kinds of evidence and arguments, really for both sides of things. And I want to suggest that maybe the evidence for theism is like this. Maybe the evidence for theism is imprecisely equal rather than exactly tied. Um, if that's true, then instead of agnosticism being the default attitude, maybe we're actually in a situation where really all three attitudes are rational, because all three attitudes are sort of reasonable responses to a complex body of evidence regarding God's existence. In the same way that, in a complicated murder trial, you could think the person's guilty and you could think the person's innocent. And it seems like both are reasonable responses given how complicated the evidence is. And I think here too, this idea that goes back to William James, that sometimes it's okay to take a risk to try to form a belief, take a risk to try to get to the truth, rather than just staying in the safe agnostic territory. James said we have two epistemic goals. We want to get at truth and avoid error, not just avoid error. And sometimes it's easy to just think about avoiding error and say, oh, if there's evidence for both sides, you should withhold. But it's like, no, sometimes it's okay to sort of take the risk and try to get the true belief. So then you might say, well, P's on a par with not P, even if it's not an exact tie, how should we break this parity? And here I've done some other videos on this. Maybe I'll do more videos on it, but one idea is to break it with non-epistemic reasons. So going beyond just evidence or arguments for and against God's existence and saying, what do I want to be true? Which is a more beautiful story, which sort of aligns with my goals or values or is morally good. I think we can maybe, if we establish there is a parity here, maybe we break that parity with non-epistemic reasons. Cool. So those are just some thoughts for today. I hope you all enjoyed this video. If you have any thoughts or comments, or is this a parity case? If not, why? If so, how do we break it? I would love to hear that in the comments. All right, have a good day, everybody.